Okay.
It goes back to the early 2000s, and Mark Evans, who had helped to salvage the Radiophonic Workshop archive, and it was all going to be taped up to go on the skip. And he'd been slowly but surely working with that archive, cataloguing it, and was beginning to prepare releases of various projects, Radiophonic Workshop projects on CD. And they started off with Doctor Who scores and sound effects. So they'd done about 4 CDs, and the initial news were going to be more of them, and then that sort of slowed down. And so I just finished my PhD, which is about film music, and this difficult second album moment. What do I do next? And so I just got in touch with Mark. Essentially, just wrote him a fan letter and basically saying that, how much I really loved his own work as a composer for Doctor Who, but also really appreciate what he was doing with the Radiophonic Workshop. And was there some way in which the university could help, maybe with the cataloguing and the kind of detective work? And so he got back in touch and said that that the BBC were retaining ownership and had plans for the Radiophonic Workshop archive and control over that. But there was this other archive which had recently been entrusted to him, and maybe we might be interested in doing something with that. And this was Delia's archive. So of course, it didn't need a second invitation. That was such an exciting prospect. And so that's really how it started. That was sort of around about 2002, and slowly but surely, sort of negotiating that and working out how it would come and where it would go. Because one thing, bringing it to the university, but where would it be stored? And building up that relationship with trust as well. So in 2005, we got sort of an initial inventory done of the contents of the archive. That was at Mark's place in Sussex. And then in 2007, everything was in place, the legal things, for the archive to come to Manchester. And the first thing that had to be done was to digitise it, because it was predominant. So the initial archive was mainly tapes and then paper documents, all relating to Delia's, primarily her freelance work. There were some BBC projects in there as well, but anything that was clearly BBC, Mark had taken that out and put back into the Radiophonic Workshop archive. So most of it is a freelance work. And then there's things in there which you can't even be certain that they're by Delia. There's off-air recordings of music or copies of LPs. And your initial reaction when you listen to that stuff is to go, oh no, that's... Because there's 267 tapes, and you're hoping initially that every tape is going to be another, lost Delian work, maybe for theatre or a live happening or some independent art film, whatever it is, or maybe just for her own amusement. So each tape that wasn't that and was a recording by Mozart off the radio, or Penderecki, or Yusuf Lateef. I was reading, there was a recording by Yusuf Lateef, which was fascinating, that she's listening to sort of a modern jazz musician who's exploring Middle Eastern and African rhythms in his music. So the initial reaction when you hear these things is, oh no, that's one less thing that might have been Delia. But of course, they're all part of the story. And it's fascinating, what is she listening to? And why was she interested in that? And how might that have been feeding into her own, what might she have taken from that and run with it in some kind of way. So nothing is wasted in an archive, and you have to overcome that initial instinct to sort of go, well, that's less important because it wasn't a piece of her music. It still tells you something really worthwhile about her. So that's the tape archive, and a lot of it also is not finished works. A lot of it is work in progress. There are like final mixes and masters of different projects, but a lot of it is, there are tapes in there where you can hear her slowly but surely, gradually transforming and augmenting a sound or a phrase into its final form. And that, again, that's really interesting because you're getting a direct insight into her working method, her practices as well. So, it's a real mixture, and there are clearly things in there which are not by her. So a lot of the freelance projects that she worked on with variously Unit Delta Plus, which was Delia, Peter Zinoviev, and Brian Hodgson, and then after that Kaleidophone. So that's dealing with Brian again. Brian being, a close friend and colleague from the Renaissance Workshop, and David Butler. And then there's some freelance work after that as well. So when you listen back to, for example, some of the theatre projects that Delia and Brian worked on, they're clearly sharing sounds, and you can hear things. There's like where she's repurposing sounds from earlier projects. So something like there's a production of Macbeth from the Royal Shakespeare Company, directed by Peter Hall, and she repurposes material from Amor Day, one of the inventions for radio. There's another theatre piece, and in the midst of it, there's bits of Delia, and in the midst of it, there's some Brian Hodgson Doctor Who sound effects, which just creates this wonderful mental image of Macbeth being pursued by the Cybermen. Might have made me took more interest in Shakespeare, when I was little, if that being part of it. So that, again, although that creates problems from an archival point of view in terms of working out authorship and who's written what, written and done what, it gives you a further insight into how they worked. It's very interesting when some of the stuff she did in the 70s, she worked on 2 films for Madeleine Hoycass and Elsa Stansfield. They were a really important partnership. They were pioneering figures in video art in the mid-1970s, and they worked very closely with Delia. And you can, some of the work that they go on to in video art, you can hear Delia's influence in their later projects, even though they're not collaborating with her. That the kind of sound design that they're doing comes out of a Delian aesthetic. But actually some of those 2 films that they do, it's all original material from Delia. She's not repurposing early material. It's very telling that at that point she was leaving the BBC, she was detaching from the BBC, and they also invited her. The first one they made is called One of These Days, and they invited Delia to go over to Amsterdam for the shoot. So she's involved really early on, and I think it's not surprising that she comes up with something much more original rather than recycling, repurposing some of her back catalogue, which she's done previously. Which is not to play down the significance of her doing that. I mean, you can make the argument for her. Essentially, she's sampling, her own material. So, anyway, that was the initial thing, to digitise, to make sure that we had digital copies of the tapes, because some of them were in fragile state. They'd been in Delia's attic in Northampton for the best part of 30 years, and in some cases some of these reels were older than that, but they'd moved around with Delia. She took them up to Cumbria with her when she went up to work by Hadrian's Wall. So they've been all over the country with her, and then she brought them back back down to Northampton when she was Clyde Blackburn, her partner. So, there was concern about the conditions there because they wouldn't have been stored in proper, appropriately environmentally controlled conditions. So that initial phase was done with Lewis Niebuhr. He came over from the United States. He's a musicologist who specialises in electronic music and British electronic music in particular. And the summer of 2007 was spent digitising the tapes. And then we'd hoped there was going to be a designated home for the archive. The music department, where I'm at, they were building a new facility for electroacoustic music and electronic music and research, and there was going to be a specialist space for Delia's archive. And unfortunately, as these things go, bit by bit, the budget got squeezed as the things developed, and one of the things that went was the designated listening space and reading room for Delia. So we had to find somewhere else, and the somewhere else was where we are now, the John Rylands Library on Deansgate in Manchester, which also was going through some major renovation. And that's been a great home for it because they've got appropriate conditions to keep rare and precious material, and they've got a fragment of one of the original Gospels here. So there's some pretty fragile stuff in the facility, and so Delia's archive came here in 2011, and so that's quite it's a length of time since it initially arrived, but it was partly because of that fall through, and then sort of finding an alternative home for it and raising the funds for that. Around about that time, Andy Wolfe from Coventry, who was living, and I'm assuming still does live, I don't know if he still does live, but was living in what was Delia's childhood home, and he had found a substantial collection of her schoolwork, and also various bits and bobs like objects and things that from her childhood in Coventry. And I think I know it had been offered to the Herbert, and for whatever reason they didn't go for it. And so John Rylands here raised the funds to acquire it from Andy Wolfe, and so that archive came, and that's been such an extraordinary addition, because it's quite rare to have an archive of somebody which charts not just their adult life, their professional work, but also their childhood, where you really get this strong sense of her emerging personality, sort of her creative ideas starting to come into play. So there's a first writing about music in there, and she's talking about composers who are, she's inspired by, and she names Mozart, Bach, Beethoven in particular, especially his sonatas, Haydn, some Shostakovich dances. Talks about those, like really enjoying some of those. Years later, when I interviewed Clyde Blackburn, her partner, he said that when he was with Delia, that her favourite composer was Eric Satie, that she just loved listening to the Gymnopédies. This is just fascinating, because how did somebody get into electronic music in Britain in the 1950s? How, never mind growing up in Coventry, anywhere in Britain, where'd you go? It's not being taught. And even at degree level, she goes on to Cambridge University. There are no modules on electronic music there. So where does that come from? And what was her interest in music? So the Childhood Archive is it's so revealing in this respect. And even in her creative writing stories, she's very often talking about sound. So there's all these little stories that she writes about just like little short pieces. And there's one about an old music store, like dusty and like bric-a-brac. And she writes about how at midnight all the instruments come to life and the metronome comes to life and the music stand, and she talks about the sound that they make, but it's not just the musical sound, it's like, you know, the creaking door and this kind of thing. So there's something there about, as a child, like being really sensitive to the sound of everyday objects and the potential of everyday objects to make music. And of course, this you can trace, I don't think it's too fanciful to say, you can trace that through to her sort of like music concrete techniques, where she's using the sound of something which is just the everyday, whether that's a metal lampshade, a knock on a door, her own voice, you know, her own breath. You can trace that back to there, you know, in those school days. One of the things that I've been working on very recently is her affinity with visual culture and visual arts. And I think this is absolutely crucial to understanding her creativity. That thing about how did she get into electronic music, to me, the turning point for her is 1958, and she goes to Brussels to the World's Fair, and she goes there with Jonathan Harvey, who she studied music with at Cambridge. And Jonathan would go on to become one of this country's major composers of sort of contemporary music. And Dealey was a direct influence on his work. Shortly before he died, he got in touch with me and said that he'd studied with Delia and they'd played music together, and they'd gone to Brussels, and when they were there, they'd gone into Le Corbusier's pavilion, which Xenakis had worked on. And so when you went inside, you would hear a piece by Xenakis as you went in, but then in the main space was Edgar Varèse's poem Electronique, which was diffused in that main space through quite a complex speaker system. And all around that were projections on the wall, visuals being projected. And this is the moment, I think, for her. This kind of like, you don't want to overplay it like this kind of like Damascene conversion or something, but I think this is this kind of like Archimedes moment for her, of electronic music working in tandem with the visual arts.